Welcome to Chapter 3, the Greek Golden Age from 500 to 400 BCE. Now, when we left off in Chapter 2, we were talking about Greece kind of coming out of the Dark Ages, right? That time where we didn't really have a whole heck of a lot of writing. And one value and notion from the last chapter that we definitely want to keep in mind in this chapter is that Athenian value of arete, right? Arete, of course, meaning excellence, right? That's that great Greek concept that you guys want to keep at the back of your mind at all times. Arete. Because this really is what drives forward almost all of what we see happening event-wise in this chapter. Especially all that war. All the city-states, as we noted in Chapter 2, right? We talked about Corinth, we talked about Athens, and we talked about Sparta as three of those many city-states in Greece, kind of all having their own personalities, having their own cultures, their own values. But one thing that all of the Greek world shared in common was a notion of arete. But in this chapter, especially, most of who we're looking at are actually Athenians. We're almost entirely in Athens because Athens experienced the quote-unquote golden age more than many of the other city-states did. And we'll see here in a moment why that was. But we want to keep arete in the back of our mind because it's that Athenian idea that they were exceptional, that they were the best of the best, that really drives a lot of the decisions that they make and drives a lot of these wars. But it also drives the recreation of the public space. We're going to see the public space open in a way that we haven't before in Greece or anywhere else in the ancient world. The public forum is going to be a very big part of Athenian life. And in fact, that's going to affect the way we read our primary source, right? Because it's that public forum that exposes the works of writers and philosophers and historians to a larger audience. But we're also going to see some tensions arise at this time because traditional values are tested by the time we reach the end of our chapter, the time when Xenophon was writing, the time when Socrates was walking the earth. Why? Because of a number of these wars and the crises that they created. What we're going to see is that people are going to be very anxious about the introduction of new ideas that challenge their typical order, the values that they've already established, especially when it comes to this notion of arete. Because if anybody challenged the notion of arete, it was Socrates. Because Socrates did believe in excellence. Yes, he did believe people should strive for excellence, but he didn't think that that excellence came from being powerful. He believed that it came from behaving according to our natures, and our natures all follow an inherent, inborn system of ethics. We're going to discuss that a little bit later in this chapter, but it's something to keep in the back of our mind, especially as we kind of establish some of the events of this chapter. Like, for example, the first real big war that the Greek world fights against Persia. And it all starts out, innocently enough. This is another one of those times when your textbook introduces a story like an attention grabber, right, to pull you into the chapter. And the story that they bring up is the story of Darius. The Athenians go to Darius for aid. Darius is the leader of the Persians. When we get into chapter 4, we'll talk a little bit more about him and the things that he did in Persia and the culture that he had in Persia. Right now we're going to focus on Greece, but we are going to bring Darius up in order to point out the way this whole war started, which was innocently enough. Athens needed money. They needed help. They needed some naval support because they were in a kind of trade war. This was in Carthage and in parts of Sicily. And this is going to be a theme for a number of the chapters basically up till about chapter 7 and 8, Sicily is a big part of the Mediterranean world because it's the breadbasket. It's where all of the real grains are grown. So it's kind of the backbone of a whole heck of a lot of Mediterranean cultures in terms of bread product. And bread is needed to feed people. It's one of the major substantive foods that we see in the ancient world. Bread, gruel, stew, because a lot of people don't eat meats in the old world, save during festivals and religious rituals, right? There's a reason why you sacrifice an animal during a festival. You're feeding that animal to the people as a part of their meat intake for the entire year. So Sicily is a pretty big deal because it's where most of our food comes from. So too is Carthage, because Carthage are the major people who are the trade route kind of educators between Sicily and the rest of the Mediterranean world. A lot of that stuff goes to Carthage first before it spreads out. So the war that Athens is having with various Mediterranean peoples is important to their future and their livelihood. So they go to Persia to ask for some money because they don't have a whole heck of a lot. They ask for some naval support because they don't have a whole heck of a lot. And Darius, who we can see here in his Civilization, the game. Civilization is a great game. That's a wonderful way to learn history. It's a strategy-based game that teaches you a lot of concepts from history, including the 7 wonders of the world, the major leaders, and many of the speeches that they give are the kinds of things we would see in a primary source, like what we see here. This is the kind of thing Darius would have said out loud to an envoy, like the envoy that came from Athens, right? Because this envoy came and made a deal with Darius. He said, okay, we're going to go ahead and give you all of that naval support and the money that you want. But what you have to do is you have to bow as a people to my great will and say that you are lesser than me. And you have to basically offer up this boon showing your submission. Now, if we know anything about the Athenians already, it's that that's not really something they're bound to do. They feel themselves exceptional. They feel themselves the best in the world. So when the envoy returns to Athens, the people refuse to hold up their end of the bargain. Now, when Darius learns of this betrayal, he makes sure that people at dinner and breakfast, when he's meeting with people to eat, all say multiple times during the meal, Lord, remember the Athenians. The idea here that he's going to wipe them from the face of the planet. And he certainly does try. Because really when the betrayal becomes apparent to Persia is during something called the Ionian Revolt. Now the Persians took over Ionia at the end of last chapter. And this was a really big loss for a lot of folks in Greece. They really felt it horrible that some barbarians that aren't even from Greece at all are taking over this major city-state. Nobody really was terribly happy about that Persian occupation. And we see this kind of come to a head when Ionian people revolt against their Persian masters. Athens supports that revolt with troops and money right after they took money from Darius. He is, of course, incensed, and he attacks Athens almost immediately. Now, Athens, though they were greatly outnumbered in this battle of Marathon in 490 BCE, really the big deciding battle of the Persian clash with Greece. The reason why they really won is that they made some tactical changes at the very last second. Basically, what they did is instead of having their hoplite formations walk slowly towards their enemy, which was the usual practice and everybody was used to that, and that was considered the honorable thing to do, Spartan generals who were really the ones who came up with a lot of the tactical issues at this time, because Sparta, as we already know from our last chapter, are very militaristic people. They're very well known for their general skills and their tactical and strategic skills in war. They decide that what the soldiers are going to do instead is they're going to run at the enemy at full speed, and in so doing they're able to win this battle. Now, Themistocles, at the end of this battle, knows that this is not the last we're going to see of the Persians. And he certainly does everything in his power to change Athenian law and to even change laws for many people all over the Greek world in order to increase naval power. In 483 BCE, he basically says we all have to build up the navy here in Athens to make sure we're prepared for the Persians when they return. And it's naval power that's going to be the big strength of Athens in the future. And of course we can see when we look at the map the reason why that would be, right? Let's face it, a lot of Greek city-states are right there on the ocean. The best possible prospect is naval power at this time. Because if we can see all of these lovely city-states, wouldn't you want to have a naval power if you are Athens and you are completely surrounded by water, right? And we're going to see that there's a number of battles, and I certainly, if you are into military history, this is a great series of battles between Persia and Greece that you can kind of explore further for your paper topic if you want to, because it begins with Darius, but it doesn't end until after Xerxes, and it's going to take a good long time. These battles are fought over multiple years, as you can see from the timeline on this map, right? All the years that this battle is fought for. And there's a lot of specific battles. Marathon is the one that we concentrate on, but Sardis was also a really big one. So too was Thermopylae. Now, it's a darn good thing Themistocles planned for the Persians to return, because in fact they returned pretty quickly under Xerxes. The only thing that kept Xerxes from returning sooner than he did was that after Darius died, there was in fact another battle for the throne, which Xerxes won. He defeated his older brother, and in so doing was able to take over the throne. So there's a few years where they had to negotiate that, which is why Athens had some time to breathe and build up that naval power. However, the thing of it is, guys, that the Persians had just a ridiculous amount of troops to throw at Greece. And Greece had a limited number of soldiers. I mean, they've got a pretty small area that they even come from in the first place. There's a limit to how much population you can throw into soldiering. And that's really going to come out in the Battle of Thermopylae, right, in 480 BCE, when the Persians are kept at bay for enough time for Athens to be evacuated. This is that famous 300 battle, right, that everybody talks about, 300. This is that battle that the Spartans are basically holding the Persians off long enough for an envoy to go to Athens, say the Persians are on their way, you need to evacuate, and give them time to do so, which is a pretty good thing because the Persians burn Athens to the ground. This is one of 3 times that Athens will burn to the ground in its history during a battle. And the people are largely evacuated to the Peloponnese. So they're in multiple city-states. That means multiple city-states. Some of them are in Corinth, some of them are in Thrace, some of them are in Ionia, etc., etc. People just move out of Athens into all of these places. Something to keep in mind is that Athenians took with them their exceptionalism and their belief that they were better than the other city-states to all the city-states who took them in as refugees. And we'll see later on when we get to the Peloponnesian War how some of the tensions that were created by that attitude, how those kind of unfold in the future. Now, though the Battle of Thermopylae was lost, and with it Athens, there was a major success in the Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE. The big thing that really made this a victory is the fact that there was a serious knowledge, especially for Spartan generals who used a knowledge of the local land, something that the Persians weren't terribly aware of. And we talked a little bit in chapter 2 about the way that city-states formed because of this terror. There's lots of rocky mountains, right? There's lots of like islands off that big peninsula, right? And that can make for some tricky terrain. But if you're from that location, you can use that tricky terrain to your advantage. One thing that happened at Salamis is that troops were rooted into a long, narrow passage of a box canyon, and the Greeks were able to stand on top and pour hot things down upon the invading Persian army. But really, a lot of this was about shrewd tactics on the part of mainly Spartan generals. Athenians really did the work of getting money secured for resources, for expanding that naval power, for making this into law that everybody has to follow. They were kind of the administrators of the war, whereas the Spartans were really the ones who did much of the generaling. That's not to say nobody else was a general. In fact, there was a number of generals from other areas. It just tended to be that the most successful and the ones that were sought after were the Spartans. And for good reason. They did have great tactics. Now, what they also had, though, was really strong body armor, because one innovation that happened at the end of our last chapter that really turned the tides of the war for people here was a better form of iron smelting that made for more rigid and unpierceable body armor, which was pretty good because the Persians' major thing that they were really great at, besides being wonderful charioteers, is that they were great with their arrows. They had just an amazing amount of arrows. You can even see this, especially like in the Anabasis that Xenophon wrote in his early career as a soldier. That idea of the sky going black with the arrows of the enemy. Persians really had their archery down. However, they were really geared towards the old body armor system. So the more that this new body armor was introduced, the better it was for having those survival rates go up under the hail of bullets. Or sorry, not bullets. Under the hail of arrows. Now, additionally, though, the Persians really had light warships. It was how they were able to get all over their empire really quickly. They had a large empire. Having a light warship is good because there's lots of places you have to go to fight. However, what the Athenians did is they routed those ships into narrow passages where their speed was not helpful any longer, and they used their much heavier warships against them and were able to win this way because they put more into making sturdy warships. Now, additionally, the biggest thing, and this is absolutely true, how the Persians were beaten back was because so many city-states allied under the Hellenic League. This was a part of that administration that we're talking about. Now, one thing that we talked about is there are a lot of Greek city-states, over 300 Greek city-states, one should know. Of those over 300 Greek city-states, we managed to have 31 of them ally with each other. That's right, only 31 of all of those city-states allied. That was a big deal, of course. Arete, excellence, competition. Getting people to align at this time was complicated and difficult work, but it needed to be done because the Persians were at our doorstep. So what we saw with the Hellenic League was all of these folks coming together and really giving up much of the leadership to Athens and Sparta. Sparta is that military back, as we talked about, in Athens as the administrative. Now here's something great. This is a series of drawings of what the different uniforms at this time looked like. I like to introduce visual sources like this, especially if any of you are interested in talking about this time period. It's good to kind of bring in some good visual sources for you so you can get a sense of how they're used, right? So as we see right here, we talked a little bit in your chapter, right, in the textbook, about how much the Greeks thought that the Persians were a little bit odd. They're a little bit odd. And here we have the Persians as these top two, right? Here and here we have the Persians. One thing that was really definitely a culture shock for the Greeks was the fact that Persians went into battle with so much clothing on. You know, like the elite guard, as we see here, these elite guardsmen who would definitely guard Darius at the capital at Susa, or they would guard Xerxes, who took his place at the capital of Susa until he moved that in the 4th century. What we see here is lots of kind of cloth, and it was brightly colored. Something that we can't really see in these pictures is that the cloth was brightly colored, and it covered most of their body. Now we can see that the Greeks fought the way they did everything, almost nude. We kind of already got into that in the last chapter. The Greeks loved to expose parts of their body. They believed that it caught the attention of the gods, that the gods would look upon their beautiful bodies and their beautiful form and say that they were strong and masculine and grant them favor and reward. So it was very, very odd for them to see all these Persians in so many clothes. But we can also kind of see the breakdown of the kinds of soldiers that we had. And on both sides, on the Persian side and on the Greek side, most of the soldiers would be guys like these, the poorest of the poor. One thing that we don't see in this Greek portrait, but that was definitely true, is we had guys like these peasants, people who would be conscripted and expected to go off to war, and all they would really have for a weapon was their farming equipment. Indeed, and that's likely where the scimitar came from in the first place. It's believed that the scimitar came from the scythe, which was used to harvest grains and other tall kind of grass-like products. And we can see that even here with the kind of not the peasant, but still the kind of lower class, what we have is basically a big beating stick. Yes, a big beating stick. But you would also have a little pouch there that you would put a rock in, so you could also throw a projectile at people. You would have a small wooden shield, and you would probably have, if you could afford it, a hat made of metal. That would be great if you could have a hat made of metal. That's pretty good stuff. Lots of people didn't. Lots of people went in like these peasants here. They went in with nothing but a bit of farm equipment. Now your other soldiers, here we have the Spartans, right? The Spartans were known for their large spears, which they used not just as projectiles and to get through shield walls, but also as leaping devices. So they would use them to leap sometimes over a shield wall into the heart of the enemy, as it were. This was a very popular tactic that the Spartans used. And we see what we'd see as the usual Athenian, which would be a short dagger. Sometimes they would have two daggers, a short one and a long one. And usually some kind of cape. Maybe they'd have a small concentric shield that would just fit their arm and not be terribly large. And of course, that awesome headdress that looks a bit like the horse. Now, So any of you who want to kind of introduce some visual sources, I would certainly recommend that one great thing to do is to look at the way that clothing tells us something about the way people are fighting and the kinds of values that they have. And that certainly would help us to explain the kind of next phase of our chapter and our war when that beautiful Hellenic League falls apart. That alliance of the 31 city-states, it was fragile at best, falls apart once the Persians retreat and Greek people have victory. And what we see is that that Hellenic League then breaks down into two kind of competing leagues. The Peloponnesian League, that's led by Sparta. And remember when we talked about Athens, right? When Athens had to evacuate the city before it burned. And we're like, well, you know, they took all of those values of we're better than people, and they went in as refugees into these places. And we're like, by the way, guys, you're all horrible, and we're much better than you. Ha ha ha. Well, all of that tension kind of stuck with people. It stuck with people, and you can see that with who really is picked up by the Peloponnesian League. A lot of those folks that had Athenians staying in their city-states whilst Athens was rebuilt, still had a bit of a grudge against that Athenian arrogance, right? And so they're going to side with the Spartans. The Peloponnese, with all of those multiple city-states inside of it, are really going to bring in the infantry. They're going to be the big providers of infantry, because if we look at that map back there, right, we'll see that the Peloponnese is actually a pretty big area that doesn't have quite as many rocky places. There's a lot more farmers there, so there's a lot more people to kind of conscript into your army. And then we're going to have Corinth, who really even before this was providing a lot of the material and had a lot of the boat makers under the Hellenic League be the provider of the navy for the Peloponnesian League. Now there's more people who are allied, but these are kind of the big names, and we're going to stick with the big names to keep it simple. Now the Delian League was established by the Athenians and of course led by the Athenians. Many of the people who allied with them were people that they helped at some point during those early Persian invasion years, like the Aegean Islands and Ionia. Ionia is going to take over where Corinth left off and be the big provider of naval power for Greece. This is where a lot of the boats are going to be put up, because here's the big thing, and this is what's going to lead us into the Greek Golden Age, the trireme system. The trireme was how you paid your dues to the league. On both sides of the fence, we're going to see the way that people pay their dues to the league as a city-state is by providing some kind of tool of war, be it infantry or naval power. For Athens, the big thing was every city-state in the league had to provide a trireme. If they could not provide a trireme, they had to provide a tribute of some kind that matched the monetary value of that trireme. But they didn't just have to provide the boat itself. They had to provide the people who ran the boat, the oarsmen, the ones who made it go forward. Because one thing that happens a lot in warm seaports like you see around Greece is that winds change a lot. And this was a big frustration. One of the ways that the trireme was better is that it had 3 major sails, and they got that innovation from the Persians and went, oh, I like that. That actually works. But even with those 3 sails that can capture more of the winds and propel the boat forward more easily, there's still times when the winds are just going to disappear. You see this happen in a lot of Greek epic poetry, right? That the gods make, some kind of ridiculous weather. Well, the reason people were writing about this is that in this warm seaport, ridiculous weather did in fact happen quite a lot. So it's a good thing to have the backup of having oarsmen who can keep getting that boat to its destination so we don't lose battles. These people would be trained. Now, if they took with them a slave, they would make double the pay that they would make if they just went on their own. And in fact, oarsmen are people often from the poorest class. They needed no former training in this, and they could come from most anywhere. So the great thing about this is that this is a way for the poor to really kind of move up into a middle class of sort. They could make a lot of money and they could gain status and power. So this created a kind of new class of people that was much like a middle class. And this is one of the many push-pull factors that we're going to see us lead into radical democracy, right? Because this is the big thing that makes Athens what it is and makes the Golden Age what it is, the rise of radical democracy. We, of course, like to hone in on this because we are a democracy ourselves, so we see ourselves in the subject matter, which is why we tend to focus on Athens in these chapters instead of Sparta or Corinth or places like that. Now we're going to focus on Athens for this lecture because we're going to tie Xenophon into him, especially when we get to the later part of this lecture. But this is setting up a lot of those foundational concepts. What Xenophon would have grown up with in his early years was radical democracy as established by Pericles from 461 to 431 BCE, whilst he was a very powerful member and leader of the League. Now, radical democracy did make it possible for more people to vote. So you didn't just have to own land to vote anymore. So this was important. However, it did set limits on who could be a citizen in a way that had not been before. So many people who, for example, may have had a mother born in Athens but a father born in Corinth were no longer considered citizens of Athens after this major radical democracy happened in this 30-year period. And this is important to note because Xenophon himself had parents from two different city-states. So he had limited citizenship because of this. He had limited abilities to vote, but he was raised in a very Athenian culture. So these are all things to kind of keep in the back of our mind because limited citizenship is going to create some tensions, but it's also going to make it more possible for radical democracy to be enacted in a practical way. Now, one thing that of course we should keep in mind all the time is that citizenship is often gendered. Women don't get to vote. Women can influence votes, and in fact, during the Peloponnesian War, many women refused to have sex with their husbands in order to get them to stop the war. And I should note, it worked. It worked. Many people voted against a war that was popular only 5-10 years previously because they weren't able to have sex with their wives. So women could have influence in some way, shape, or form, but it certainly wasn't the kind of influence that men have as citizens in direct voting. However, there's still selective leadership because even with the voting, there were still people who were chosen at random through lottery, like the Council of 500. And then we also had people who were considered the elders, people who had been in practice for a very long time, the archons, right? The elders, the leaders. These were people who had proven themselves in war and in politics. Then we had the executive board, and this is where we get a lot of the elections from, right? We get the annually elected generals. These were the guys who really set the strategies and tactics for war. They were the ones who decided whether or not we should take, a peace treaty, which is going to come up here in a moment. When we see people who are refusing to take a peace treaty, they're people who were voted in. And we've got a lot of minor officials, but the really big thing about radical democracy, and this is the biggest one, guys, is that Pericles, with his reforms, really made the court system more even-handed for more classes and more people. Because before, it was really very easy for a rich person to never have to face the consequences of their actions. Now, this is not to say naively that rich people weren't still able to grease the right palms and get out of pain for things that they did, but their ability to do so was severely limited. And we'll see this even with Pericles, because Pericles himself is going to go to court and be found guilty of extortion. Yes, and embezzlement. Two very major crimes, the embezzlement being the big one, and we'll talk a little bit about that more here in a moment. But something that should be brought up here is many of the people who voted could not actually read or write. They voted by writing names on broken pieces of pottery that would be outside of the voting center, like these ones right here. Above that pottery pile, there would be a sign that had the names of the various peoples who were being voted for and the various peoples who were up for something called ostracism. And this is where we really start to feel Xenophon in our chapter. Because one thing that happened, especially when we enter into the Peloponnesian War, is that very great generals were feared, especially in Athens. Why? Because the idea was they would be so popular that they could take over and establish a tyranny like that we see in Corinth, right? And we didn't want great men ruling. So what would happen is that they would be put up for ostracization. So when you arrived at the voting place, there would be people who would be announcing who's up for ostracization. So they'd say, who do you want to kick out of Athens? And there'd usually be a number of people lined up in the public forum to speak for or against somebody, right? So if you were a powerful person, if you were in politics, or if you were a general and you knew that you were up for ostracization, you would say, okay, I'm going to hire a really great orator to go stand out and say why I'm great and I should be kept. But, you know, I think that we can definitely relate to that now too, is that sometimes people vote for all the wrong reasons. And we have a great story in here about one general who is ostracized and runs into somebody in the street and says, who are you ostracizing? He tells the person his name. And he asks him, he knows that this man doesn't know him. He doesn't know who he is. He says, why are you ostracizing this man? He said, I don't know. His name sounds funny, basically, is what it came down to. I just don't think I'd like him with a name like that. And in fact, a number of people could be kicked out of Athens and other city-states and exiled from city-states because they became too popular or because they had powerful enemies who were able to persuade masses who may or may not have had the ability to read. So we can see the kind of malleability there and the kind of popular culture and the way that that influenced this legal and political system. And it certainly was influential for Xenophon because Xenophon was exiled multiple times because he was popular, because he was successful, because he wrote prolifically and was very popular as a writer. People enjoyed his style. He was very popular with the poor people because he had a very simple style, that Attic style that our Encyclopedia Britannica talks about. Attica is in Sparta. This was the military style, and my military students and my hybrid courses will hopefully understand this, and we talked about it a little bit in research papers in U. When you write for the military, you write for an efficient purpose. It's just the facts, ma'am. You keep it simple because a lack of simplicity can lead to miscommunication, and miscommunications can be costly. And we definitely see this reflected in Xenophon's writing. He kept it simple for a reason. And it's also what made him very popular with a lot of poor people. The fact that he could have been understood more readily than somebody perhaps giving a more high and oratory kind of the speech that's filled with all of those flourishes that the Athenians were really well known for. If you read Athenian Greek, it's really flourishy. It has a lot of kind of fluff, right? And there's a lot of calling back to long stories about the gods. Xenophon wasn't into this as much because that's what would bore his usual audience of poor people who really quite loved him. So it's something to keep in the back of your mind when you're thinking about your PSA, because there are limits to this democracy, as ostracism shows us. There are limits to this democracy, and this is certainly true for the people who are left out. Largely slaves, women, and medics. Medics being foreigners, people who are not from Athens. And that could include somebody who's from a city-state 50 miles away from Athens. That is a foreigner, and they have no voting rights. They have no ownership rights, and they have very little that they can do in the court system. And this is the big one. If they get into a scuffle over perhaps a deal that somebody makes. So if I'm a medic, I'm from Corinth and I'm staying in Athens. Say I make a deal with somebody over some wine and they rip me off. It's very difficult for somebody from Corinth to get justice for that over an Athenian, because the Athenian has rights that that foreigner does not have. And we should keep in mind that the number of slaves is going to keep rising, because a number of people became slaves over kind of silly things, like being in debt. Slavery was one way to get out of debt. You could work it off. This was an age when slavery wasn't something that you passed down to your children. It's something that began with you and ended when your manumission or service was over. And many slaves were actually given things like land and leadership positions and tutoring positions. Most of the people who were tutoring young people at this time in foreign languages were slaves from foreign countries. So there were ways that all of these people influenced life and culture around them, but they were cut off from being represented in courts and from being represented in voting. However, one thing that everybody could take advantage of was the expansion of the public space during this time. And there's a pretty good reason why the public space expanded so much. Athens burned, right? Now it's been a while since Athens burns. When we're under Pericles, Pericles, in fact, takes a lot of money from the League and uses it to rebuild Athens to the tune of many billions of dollars in today's money. And he wasn't alone, because if you wanted to be powerful, if you wanted people to vote for you, you would do things to make them vote for you. Like you would set up a religious festival. You would provide all of those awesome bulls and lambs to be sacrificed at the religious ritual, which will feed people a meat that they only get to eat 2 or 3 times a year, right? That's going to make you popular. You're going to put up buildings, right, that people can go and leave offerings at. And in fact, one thing that should be kept in mind is that religious buildings at this time were not places where people went to gather like a modern day Christian church. These were considered places where the gods lived. The gods came down into this building and lived in this building, and by being close to the people of that town, were able to gift them with their blessings, right? They were able to give them good fortune. They were able to set fate on the right course for these people. They were able to save them from egregious circumstances. Now, regardless, though, during religious festivals, people would go and leave offering to the gods at these temples. They would walk around them and see all of the wonderful statuary, right? And they would all tell them tales about who they were and what they thought was important. Because all of those patron deities we remember from chapter 2 are attached to this idea of who people were. Athenians loved Athena. So there's lots and lots of buildings built to Athena by various people who were struggling to gain political power. But it was also a lot of practical stuff, like city buildings, roads, right? Public works, like setting up a basic sewer systems so the city isn't so filthy and nasty. And this is important. The less people die of disease, the happier they're going to be, the more they're going to vote for you. We'll also see the establishments of a lot of state buildings to accommodate this expanded radical democracy. And we're also going to see a lot of things built for the poor, because the poor, by and large, especially all of those oarsmen that are going into the middle class and become a big part of that radical democracy, people who are soldiers become a big part of the radical democracy, be they hoplites like Xenophon was in his early career, or oarsmen. These folks made up the backbone of radical democracy. So it was about building a world that would make their life easier, like giving them agoras, right? Agoras were lovely places where people could meet and trade goods. But then there was also the stoas, and this was probably one of the most important ones. These were these little shade buildings that people could sit in that were made out of a clay that maintained cool, which is pretty good when you're walking along those bright white roads that you see a lot in Greece. They're hot. You get all that sun shining off that white road. I don't know if you've ever walked along a road made of any kind of white material. It's pretty devastatingly hot as an endeavor. So having shade is a really great thing to provide for people, and that can get you votes. And then there's the stuff that would be built for the elite, like the gymnasia, where people would go to learn and to practice their skills for all of those Olympic competitions, right? For strategies for being military commanders and generals. So it's rather likely that Xenophon at some point in his life was introduced into the gymnasia, probably under the mentorship of another man. And then there was also symposia. And this is kind of an important thing to think about, and we'll talk a little bit more about it here in a moment, because it connects us to Xenophon and one of those puzzles that we see in his piece. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But we're also going to see a lot of art and theater develop. Theater is always going to develop in tandem with religious festivals that are usually going to be placed around harvest. That's the reason why Dionysus is the god of wine and the god of the harvest, right? He's a god of both, because you drink a lot of wine during a religious festival, but you also bring in the harvest. And that's why you see Artemis being, the goddess of both theater, right? And the goddess of the hunt, because these two things kind of went together. Because one thing that you would want to do for a religious festival is go out and hunt the thing that you are going to sacrifice to the gods. And that would be usually done some point, in theater probably developed out of these religious rituals from the early age of Greece. And we're going to see the forms change up a little bit. We're going to see a little bit more definition, especially idealism, right? Idealism is the name of the game. It's about that arete, that excellence, and showing it. You're going to see the men with really well-developed musculature. And the more we push into the Peloponnesian Wars and the bloodier they get, the more muscular these men get, because they are a product of that idealism of war, right? They serve a function. Now, one thing that you might notice in a lot of sculptures is the penis size. And I'm going to say this out loud, and I'm going to have you all be adults about this, because the history of sexuality is something that very much helps us understand culture. And one thing that we'll see in the Greek world is that the penis was supposed to be small unless it was being shown connected to some story of a trickster god, or a god well known for being a Lothario, for going out and having sex with lots of people, right? The idea there being that that was a joke. Really, what they wanted people to concentrate on was the manliness of the form, which had a higher function. Sexuality was not as high a function at this time, and it was something that was done because it had to be done, but it certainly wasn't something that was promoted as a status symbol. And that's kind of a big deal because this is not just going to influence the people of Greece and the way their statuary is there, it's actually going to influence the statuary in the Renaissance when we take up a lot of these forms again, though the people of the Renaissance won't really know why they're doing it that way, the way the Greeks would. And now we have that symposium, and this is one scene of a symposia that's on one of the most popular, and we've seen quite a few of these pottery forms that are in the black and that kind of lovely rust color. This is a very, very popular art form that traveled all over the Mediterranean world at this time. And here we have the scene of a symposia. This would be when you would go to the house of somebody who is trying to become powerful or trying to run for office. They would throw a party and they would invite powerful people over, and they would give them wine and they would give them good food, and people would of course get up to some interesting things. The women would go off to their own section after the dinner. They would all meet for a dinner together. The women would at this point be influential in the way that they carried themselves in the discussions, and in fact many people who were women were very good at influencing people at symposia. This is one way a woman could have her voice heard, especially if it was a voice of critique. Pericles, for example, was put down a number of times by a number of wives who really felt that his policies were problematic, especially after their husbands had been gone for the war for a really long time. You know, they would take this time to let Pericles know with a very cutting, sarcastic remark what they thought of him. And that did in fact carry weight because arete was expressed through social status, through the social milieu. So symposiums weren't just big, wild parties. No, they were supposed to serve a function. You're getting out there, rubbing elbows, making yourself known. One thing that would also happen at these symposias is we'd have women called hetares. These are talked about in your chapter. These are not, in fact, prostitutes. This is really more like what we see in geisha culture or with concubines. These are women who are trained in many arts. Usually they knew how to play multiple instruments. They would be trained in epic poetry. They would know about politics. They would have witty banter with men in homosocial spaces because after that dinner was over, the women and the men would go to separate spaces where debauchery would happen. Usually there'd be a lovely painting or a mosaic on the wall depicting some graphic sexual scene from a well-known story from a god, right? And that would be a moment where everybody would sit around it and joke and make, you know, various puns about that particular story. They would, you know, have a bit of wine, they'd get naked, and, you know, sometimes things would happen. Now, it should be known, though, that even with all of that naughtiness, there was still the expectation that people would act in a way that was good for their family, according to those values that we established in Chapter 2. And this is important when we think about Xenophon, right? Because Ischomachus and his wife were involved in that scandal we were talking about, right? With Callias or Calais, depending on who you ask, that's how it's pronounced. He threw a large symposia party, which Ischomachus and his wife attended. It should be known that at this point, Ischomachus was already fallen on hard times. He'd already gambled quite a bit of the family fortune away. And this is mentioned in the symposia. And he was basically going to the symposia to try to get some mentorship from one of these powerful men so he could start making money and become powerful and thus be able to pay off his debts. Instead, he became embroiled in a torrid menage a trois with himself, his wife, and the person who was throwing the party, and basically attempted to pimp his daughter and his wife off to Callias. This act got him and his family exiled from Athens. Now, it should be noted that the Symposia was written before our source, the Economicus. So when Xenophon talks about Ischomachus and his wife and uses Ischomachus to establish the ideal way a household should be run between a man and a woman, this, if I were hearing this in the public forum read out loud, which is one of the ways that this source would have been exposed and disseminated to the public, is by being read aloud in public forums. If I were out hearing this story in the Economicus, I would already know about the Symposia because I'm probably a fan of Xenophon's. Word gets around too, you know how it is. It's the same way it is now, just much slower and with much less video involved. You know, spoilers. People give away what was said in the Symposia last year, and you know something about that story. When you go up to hear the Economicus then, and you hear the story of Ischomachus and his wife, how would you feel knowing that Ischomachus is a man who did not live up to his household obligation? He gambled away his fortune. He defiled and desecrated the sanctity of his marriage by attempting to pimp his daughter and his wife out to Callias, and in so doing ruined his entire family. So when we're viewing Economicus as a source, and especially this tale of Ischomachus and his wife and him training his wife, how would we apply a little bit of a grain of salt, knowing what we do about the Symposia? It's something to keep in the back of your mind. Now, in addition to the public space expanding, we have private spaces expanding too. The Symposia kind of girds that gap, doesn't it? It's a little bit public when we have that lovely dinner where we all gather around. It's not completely public, right, though, because not just anybody can show up off the street and attend a Symposia. No, you have to be invited. So it's not particularly public, and there's certainly a whole lot of private that happens there, but there's still a lot of public expectations in public notions of how one should behave. But the private space was also kind of developed with notions of how people should behave. People were expected to have things a very specific way in order to relay something about themselves to the people around them. For example, the elite. There was a lot of women in the elite class who would wear leaded makeup, and that's in and of itself a horrible, horrible thing that so many women probably died in Athens at this time, so they could look like they stayed inside all time, because that was expected. If you were elite and you made a lot of money, your wife should never ever really have to leave the house. She can stay in her large house with an interior courtyard where she could hang out with various people. But the idea was that she wasn't to go out in public spaces, and if she did, she needed to be escorted by a man, as we established in chapter 2. But these women did in fact have access to education. Many of them were tutored, those medics, right, that we're talking about. They would come to the home of an elite person and tutor all the children. Women who are going to be good wives should be able to go to a symposium and carry on a perfectly acerbic political conversation with their fellows, and in order to do so, they need to be educated. Now, their education was not as complete as that as their masculine counterparts. It ended much before it did for the men. However, they did have access. Now, something to think about is that during this time period, the dream, and this definitely developed at the beginning of the Golden Age and really persisted as a point of nostalgia even after it stopped being true. The dream was to go and live on a country estate. You would have your country home just outside of the city, so you could still go into the city and do all of those political things, but you could be away from the hustle and the bustle of it all, because as we noted before, cities at this time are filthy, they're stinky, they're noisy, they're filled with the rabble. So the best thing to possibly do is have the country estate. It's one of the things that a lot of upper level generals really wrote about a lot. You see this in Xenophon's early writing, where he talks very, very, very almost nostalgically about this idea, and the idea that he hears communicated by his fellow troops of going to live in the countryside, the idyllic life. This comes from the term Idealists, which was a book written about the idyllic life, about living on a country estate, living in nature, living out where the air is clean and the grass is gorgeous and the sunsets are for real. This was the dream for a lot of people, but only really people in the elite could very much afford it. Those in very, very successful generals. So you would have to be super, super successful as a general to afford this dream. Xenophon absolutely had this dream. It never came true for him, though, because he continued to be exiled. And you have to think, when he's talking about running a household estate, he's likely talking about the kind of estate you would find out in the countryside. So how interesting is it that he's writing this at the time he is, because by the time we reach the Peloponnesian War, that dream is dead. Not many people can move out to the countryside because a lot of the countryside is ravaged by war, because money is tight, because debt is spiraling out of control. All of these things are going to put a kibosh on the idyllic life, and we'll definitely see the consequences in the writings of Xenophon. Now, as per usual, the poor have a very different state of affairs. They live in very, very, very large apartment complexes. And one thing that we'll see actually happen at the end of this Athenian golden age, when it all starts to collapse, is that one of the things that Pericles did when he was embezzling money is he sandbagged. That's a term that we use to describe when you take money from a government or administrative source and say you're going to put it into a project and get the most cheap, not so great items that you possibly can, so you can have really low costs and pocket the rest of the money. He did this, and in fact, many of the apartment buildings that were built at the late end of that period collapsed at some point, especially under the pressures of the Peloponnesian War and the siege of Athens. And this was a huge problem, and it cost a lot of powerful people a whole heck of a lot of the popular vote, because people who look across the street and see an apartment building that had thousands of people in it, as many of these apartment buildings did, collapse, are going to be pretty pissed off at the guy who built it, aren't they? Indeed. Now, one thing that the poor don't have to worry about, though, social freedom wise, is they don't have to deal with gender seclusion. Women are expected to go everywhere because, gee golly, you have to when you're poor. You can't choose to stay at home. You got to go and work some jobs. Now, it should be noted, though, that for the people of the lower class, if you were kind of burgeoning into the middle class, if maybe your husband was an oarsman, you'd probably go out and buy makeup so you could look a little bit more rich, so people would think you were a little bit better off. It's that usual middle class keeping up with the Joneses, because it was still considered amazing to have gender seclusion. Something to consider. Now, one of the private spaces that also existed in tandem to living spaces was the spaces assigned for the mystery and the hero cults, which definitely just kind of blew up at this time. Now, part of the reason that it blew up is because of the influence of the Persians, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in your next chapter. But another reason it blew up was this idea of the hero, very much attached to the idea of war. And as the Peloponnesian War stretched on, we kind of really needed the concept of heroes because it was a devastating war, especially for Athenians towards the end. So the idea of someone who could rise up and take out the Hydra as Heracles did, right? It was powerful to people, and people would go and offer up charms. They would have shrines inside of their household to these heroes. Sometimes they would have mystery and hero cults in the dark recesses of a home, right? You would travel over the water to symbolically denote that you're traveling over the river Styx, right? To go to your shrine. These were very powerful places for people to meet and carry out everyday religion that was separate from these kinds of large religious rituals. But one thing that we saw in this period was a lot of tension. A lot of tension. And one area where this tension kind of builds to a head is in the fields of philosophy and science. Now, the sophists, as your chapter notes, kind of came out with this new and radical idea for how to be powerful in politics. And we know that politics is how people become powerful. And the way that you wage politics is to make sure that you influence and persuade enough of the people. So the thing that developed out of the sophists was this idea of rhetoric. How do you create the best possible appeals that can win people over to your argument? The idea here was that truth was subjective. We couldn't know the actual truth. And one of the reasons why this philosophy develops when it does is because of the Peloponnesian War, because of that situation that we see our writer Xenophon living under. That there's so many people who are displaced by the war and wandering. There's so many foreigners kind of interchanging in a way that they had not in the earlier Athenian Golden Age, and especially not in the last chapter. This exposure to the foreigner meant that people saw that other cultures had different ideas of right and wrong that weren't particularly bad, like, being exposed to Spartan generals for so long and knowing that they were successful and that they helped to win the war against Persia made many people respect them, just as Xenophon respected the Spartans for this. So if we know that Spartans do something different than we do as Athenians, but we respect them, how can we make that fit? Well, the idea here was that truth depends on where you are and when you are, right? It's relative to the time and the place in which it's being formed. One of the major people who drove this forward was Protagoras, right? And he really had this idea that if we are subjective with our truth, then it is possible for us to persuade anyone to any argument. And we don't have to have it meet with some internal system of justice associated with the gods, because as many of these folks pointed out, and as we pointed out in our last chapter, the nature of the gods could be pretty tricky, right? I mean, it's pretty gosh darn tricky. And that's something to keep in mind when we think about why these tensions emerge, because there's already kind of the seeds for these tensions planted way back when all of this religion really started becoming popular in the first place. But they also they believed that, gods really didn't influence these things. They believed that the gods could exist, but they weren't really terribly convinced that the gods did anything on this earth to affect human endeavors. The idea here being that we are the ones who affect and push forward human endeavors. Now, the sophists saying all of these things was a serious challenge to this tradition. I mean, when the Peloponnesian War started to drag on and Athens started to lose, many people said that the reason that Athens was losing is because it lost its sense of religiosity, that it lost its connection to the gods, that it was not respecting the gods enough. So they went after people who they felt were not giving the gods their due. They went after the sophists, and they went after some of the philosophers, like Socrates, a very important subject for us to understand, especially when we're thinking about our primary source analysis, right? Socrates challenged a lot of traditional notions. He did not believe that justice came from power. He didn't believe that justice came from the gods. Justice came from human nature, a universal system of ethical standards that could be tested and deduced logically through questioning. We had to continually question the world around us to come to the answers that we need. Now, the problem with this notion, what made him a fearful person for many Athenians, was this kind of Greek family system, right? That the father and a mentor would raise a young man up and take him through the political system. And they wouldn't just show him how to go through the political system in terms of making the right speech or throwing people off their feet or winning an argument. No, they would do it by worshiping the gods appropriately at symposia too. Like, they would make sure everybody saw that they had a household shrine where the gods would be worshipped, so they would know that they were godly people, so they know that they were doing their duty as Athenian citizens and not bringing down hubris and thus miasma from the gods. Miasma being this idea that if you did not live up to your obligation to the gods would visit upon you horrible, horrible events, and they would visit them upon all the people around you. We see this taking place in a lot of those hero myths that you guys may be familiar with, like Hercules, like Jason and the Argonauts. We see this idea coming up. So the more the Peloponnesian War drags on, which by the time Xenophon is writing down the Socratic text, it should be noted, we've already gotten to the end of the Peloponnesian War, and we're entering into a long, protracted period of chaos, social order, disarray, like we saw with the 30 tyrants in the Civil War. Xenophon was writing under all of these things in tandem because they happened very quickly, one after another. In the Peloponnesian War, the more it dragged on, the more people turned to people like the Sophists and to Socrates and said, you are not giving the due to the gods, and it's your fault that all of this is going wrong. Of course, one could definitely say that it probably had a little bit more to do with tactics, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a moment. But what was also challenging to people was the development of new systems of medicine that were highly influenced by exposure to the Persians. When we get into the next chapter, we're going to talk about how much the Persians, and also in terms of this war when we were fighting in Carthage, the Egyptians influenced Greek medicine and the development of Greek medicine, most specifically with systems of the interior of the body, with better understanding of the ventricle systems, of vivisection and dissection that allowed people to know about the nervous system. But this all kind of began with Hippocrates, who said that the best way to treat people was not to go through magical appeals to the gods, which was usual. You would you would have somebody go on your behest to the gods and offer them something and say, oh, please, please, please make sure that her daughter is cured, right? This is the way that people tended to get around sickness and death. They went to the gods. And if you see some of Hippocrates' writing, this is something that he discusses, the usual treatment that people are given for illnesses. But he really believed that you could diagnose an illness from observing a person, that most of these disorders came from something in the person, their diet, their humors, the exposure that they have to various stimuli and environments. And he really developed this system a lot. We have very little in the way of writing from Hippocrates himself, but we do have a lot from the people he taught, much like Socrates. Though Socrates never wrote anything down himself, a lot of people were influenced by his ideas. So too is true with Hippocrates. And with all of these groups, we saw a lot of tension emerge around the way that they denied the will of the gods and the way they saw the world. And this translated even to history. One thing that we see with Xenophon is Xenophon was a historian. Now, as a historian, Xenophon did like to put in a lot of moral lessons. He had a very strong opinion. But why wouldn't he? He was a general actually fighting in the wars that he was writing the history about. So you tended to see a lot of that kind of perspective, but he would also have some kind of moral imperative that would drive the story. It's usually the lesson he had learned by the end of it as a general for what makes success and failure, for what makes good people and what makes bad people, etc., etc. Xenophon was very much in a school of thought of history where you were supposed to promote a sense of moral and ethical obligation through your history writing. And you see this in the way that he presents history. It's one of the reasons for many years that a lot of historians stopped reading Xenophon as a historian because they said he wasn't quite so observational, he wasn't quite so removed. Not quite as removed as what we see with Herodotus and Thucydides. With both of these writers, we see the divine kind of taking out of it. These wars weren't fought or lost because of the divine will of the gods. They were fought and lost because of decisions that men made, right? So you get for the first time in the histories a description of the Persian Wars, a clash between the cultures of the East and the West. Now it should be noted that Herodotus is a favorite of colonial historians, and Herodotus has come under quite a bit of heat in recent years because Herodotus is not particularly the best source himself sometimes. Herodotus spent a good portion of his career under a 30 tyrant, one of the 30 tyrants, right? So he spent a good portion of his career being basically led around by a fellow who expected him to write things very specifically for a very specific task. For example, in the histories, Herodotus describes that in India there are giant ants that carry gold. Why? Because he was trying to get people behind launching an invasion against Persia in India. Because that's what his tyrant wanted him to do. Now, it might also be noticed that Thucydides, in his history of the Peloponnesian War, was a little bit less xenophobic than Herodotus was, because Herodotus was very xenophobic. He considered other cultures to be barbaric, wretched, and cruel. And part of the reason why he believed there was a clash of cultures between Persia and Athens, and specifically in Greece in general, is because the Persians didn't understand the things we did because they're barbarians. And this is a great line and tactic to take many years later in the 16th and 17th century when Herodotus becomes very, very popular again and continues to be so to about 20 years ago when people started questioning this. He became popular because he was the justification. They could point to Herodotus and say, see, we have this long tradition that justifies us invading the Persians because the Persians are cruel and wretched. This is part of the reason why we have so many misrepresentations of the Persians in our culture, is because of works like these. Now, Thucydides was not quite as bad. He really believed that these wars were about power and politics, right? He believed that certain politicians were trying to get power by keeping war going, and that was really why it dragged on for so long. But what all of these authors, including our own Xenophon, share in common when it comes to the way that they wrote the Peloponnesian War is that all of them saw it as a disastrous failure by the end that really drained all of the city-states of their prestige and their excellence. Because it did, guys. It really, really did. And in fact, I'm going to skip the whole tragedy and comedy because as a public art it is important, but I think that your book does a great job of explaining it. It's not going to pop up in any quizzes or anything like that. And I'd like to continue with the Xenophon basis. So on your own time, do check something out in the textbook there. There's a few pages there where they talk about comedy and tragedy. You can definitely check those out. Let's really talk about the end of the Greek Golden Age from 431 to 403. And you'll note that this is the time when our author is writing. The Peloponnesian War between the Hellenic League and the Delian League was really, really massive as an undertaking. The Persians got involved. They at first backed Sparta towards the end of the war. They backed a few people. They kind of changed sides a number of times at the end of the war. But at the beginning, a lot of the money and the naval power that Sparta got came from Persia. This was part and parcel of that horrible thing that Athenians did to them way, 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 way back in the day, right? They didn't let go of this notion. People still held it in their minds. Now, the Delian League was led muchly by Athens. And we already kind of talked about the key features of these. So let's kind of talk a little bit about the war itself. Now, Pericles was the big leader of Athens. And his big plan was basically that they were going to use their superior navy and avoid land battles to wage much of their attacks over sea to rout and take down Spartans at sea. And the way that he really wanted to do that was by sieging Athens. So basically what he said is all great Athenian citizens, you need to come inside the city walls. We're going to close it down. There's a long wall that leads from the gate of Athens that was built specifically for this purpose to the port, so people can still get supplies, so they can still get their ships, and they can still get military personnel out, etc., etc. But people are under siege. They're trapped in the city. And this was a pretty successful tactic for a good long while. One of the things that Pericles did when he rebuilt the city is he rebuilt it with the idea that war with Sparta needed to happen and that they needed to be fortified against it. So there was quite a bit of planning, but siege warfare is deadly and horrible. It's psychologically trying for people to be stuck inside of the city walls for that long. All of those country estates, right, the ones that people like Xenophon would have been expecting to come home to, are being burned down outside by the Spartans, who have a superior infantry. And they also learned quite a bit from the Persians and got a lot of chariots. And that allowed them to really raise the countryside in a way they had not before. And for Athens, there's going to be a lot of starving. The poorest of the poor are going to be the ones who are cut off when food needs to be rationed. They're the ones that are going to die of famine and of plague. And in fact, we see this happening. We see this confirmed by mass graves in catacombs under the city and in the outskirts of the city. We see this in the source evidence that we have of people writing at that time. It was very, very intense. And in fact, it was so intense that it led to something that commonly happens when a city is under siege. a plague broke out. A massive, massive series of diseases attacked the city, as is bound to happen because all of those public services, the people who came and carted your trash away, all of the people who cleared out the sewage system so it continued to flow. These people no longer there, and if they are, they're really conscripted to other more important tasks. So at this time, with all these people stuck inside a city with less food, with less resources, with less public services, what we see is that people become diseased pretty quickly, and it leads to some massive death. And in fact, it even takes out our great, great leader, Pericles. Pericles dies from the plague. And because he died from the plague, his leadership was taken over by Alcibiades, I believe is how you pronounce this. Alcibiades. Yeah, that's how you pronounce that. Now, one thing to keep in mind, guys, with this is that even if Pericles would not have died, he was on his way out. He had already been taken to court and tried for embezzlement, and there was a pretty big contingent in the city that was against him, especially because Pericles turned down a couple of peace offers, and that pissed a number of people off. He also liked to start wars with other city-states to get more money so he could embezzle more of it so he could build more awesome things. Now, when he dies, the siege tactic is abandoned, and instead, the general who takes over decides, you know what we're going to do? We're going to go and invade Sicily because then I can feed the people, and once the people are fed, they'll be much happier, and they'll follow me no matter what I do, and we'll win this great resource that everybody here needs because, as we noted, Sicily is the breadbasket. Well, that doesn't go terribly well for him at all. He loses horribly. And in fact, he loses so horribly that he is exiled almost immediately. And what he does is he defects and joins the other side, the Spartans, and brings them just a ridiculous amount of success in Sicily and in Carthage. And this is going to have some consequences even in our later chapters when we start talking about Rome, etc. So this is one of those times, right, when a general, if he's successful or if he's not successful, is exiled, and in so doing is able to take secrets with him to the enemy. This happened a lot, as it did with Xenophon, our writer, who defected a number of times and would give advice to one city-state based upon his knowledge of another, because he served under them for a while. And we can kind of see what that got Xenophon. Xenophon didn't do terribly well. It was very difficult for him. He had to wander the earth for a very, very long time. And during this period, it was a hard time to do that. It was a hard time to be Greek at the end of by the end of the Peloponnesian War. It had dragged on, as you can see, for a long, long time. By the end of the 30 Tyrants and the Civil War, from the beginning to the Peloponnesian War, it's going to be about 50 years of solid disruption in people's everyday lives, a disruption of those Greek value systems. We have to keep in mind that Xenophon is writing at this time. He's actually even writing at the cusp between the end of the Peloponnesian War, when people are so upset about people like Socrates, right? So upset about people like the sophists, right, and the historians, because they're defying the gods. This is when Xenophon is writing. He's also writing under the 30 Tyrants, because the Peloponnesian War is lost by Athens, primarily because generals do not take peace treaties. Pericles being one of the people who refused a peace treaty, so too did other folks. that Sparta offered, that Persia offered, that Corinth offered. They would offer a peace treaty and it would be rejected because of that concept of arete. They believed that they were amazing and that they shouldn't have to bow down and bow their will down to these other folks. And it cost them plenty. It cost them plenty because by the end of the war, debt was spiraling out of control. The city was ravaged by disease. The countryside, where much of people's everyday eating products came from, was ravaged by the Spartans. In Sicily, the bread box is now under the control of the Spartans. So what we see come up at this time is a series of tyrants, the 30 tyrants. It should be noted that not all of these tyrants were particularly bad guys. Some of them were actually pretty awesome. They did some pretty great stuff. They did public works, they helped with the poor, they set up orphanages for people displaced by the war. Some of these tyrants did things like this. This is how they became tyrants. Remember when we're talking about that exile system, right? Why they were exiling soldiers is so they wouldn't become a tyrant like these tyrants. And in fact, the tyrants had been part of all of these kinds of collaborators, elite collaborators, right? Who were Athenian to an extent, but many of them were collaborating with Sparta or Persia, and they were set up as kind of puppets, right, to lead from afar. Now, the 30 Tyrants period was one of protracted violence in the streets. There was a lot of loss of law and order. You would see, I mean, one of the ways that you became a tyrant is by going and killing the person who was your competitor. I mean, there's a reason why there was 30 tyrants in a really short period of time. It's because they constantly murdered each other. One popular tactic, right, would be to send a series of your mentees, the people under your tutelage, to hang out with a fellow that was your rival. Walk up to him in the street and kind of surround him with an entourage and be like, "Oh, we love you. We loved what you were doing the other day. Great." And they would bring out their nice stabby knives and stab the guy to death and then disappear into the streets of the city. It was a very violent time. People were very angry too at each other. They were angry because Athens failed. They were angry because democracy was over. They were angry because they lost their dominance in the Greek world. And we saw this expressed in a lot of attacks that people would wage against each other. This is one of the reasons why Socrates is, in fact, is supposedly, according to a few of our sources, put to death by the Athenian government, because the idea here is that everything went to crap because we weren't behaving the way good Athenians should. And this was especially hard because of something called the Treaty of Amnesty, because the 30 Tyrants period was so bloody and contracted. And then there was a revolt against the tyrants and a civil war that lasted for some years. And when the government was indeed set back up again, one of the things that they did to try to end the violence and get everybody started on the right track was by putting together a treaty of amnesty that basically meant that anybody who did anything under this time period of the 30 tyrants and even at the end of the Peloponnesian War could not be brought to trial for those actions. So if you collaborated, because so many people did, this just tells you how many, for example, mercenary soldiers were going from one person to another, that we have to have a treaty of amnesty, because if we killed them all, there'd be no people left. That's how kind of spread out this was. But that made people really, really angry. The fact that they could not, kill off the people that they thought were the enemies of the state was very, very psychologically traumatizing for Greeks. And though, those great mercenary soldiers, because they weren't put to death, were able to bring in lots of new cultural forms that we'll see really blossom and develop in the Hellenistic era, they were the first to kind of introduce outside culture into this world. there was quite a bit of tension. Um, by the end of these battles, we see Athens in a very different position than when we started the lecture. We see a city brought to its knees. And when we go into chapter 4, we'll kind of address a little bit of what happened to some of our characters from this time period. We know that Pericles is already dead. He was already tried and came up guilty for embezzlement, but luckily the plague saved him from ever having to pay those fines off. Xenophon is wandering the city-states looking for a permanent home. When we return to chapter 4, we'll see how some of these things are resolved when the Macedonians take advantage of this kind of disruption in Greek life and mop up after all of the wars and disruption of this time period. The Macedonians come in and kind of take over, and with them comes the advent of Alexander the Great. Now, remember, for further reading, you can see some really great stuff on social history. I would super recommend, if any of you are interested in this topic, or if you want to explore further the kinds of conditions people like Xenophon were living under, I would super recommend this book. It has a specific chapter that's about soldiers. Soldiers in the Peloponnesian War and the kinds of lives that they had. And this is very germane to our understanding of Xenophon, right? So if you're still struggling with how am I going to get Xenophon, that's one place you can go to. Another great place you can go to is Robin Waterfield's Xenophon Retreat, Greece, Persia, and the End of the Golden Age. This is a great book that discusses some of the ways, and I'm reading that right now, I'm almost done with it. It discusses some of the ways that these kind of Greek values are challenged, and we see this expressed by some important people in culture like Xenophon. So I hope you guys have been able to connect Xenophon, our primary source analysis author, in with some of this textbook material through our notions of Socrates, through this notion of arete, through our understanding of the symposia in the public forum, in the public space. Connect these ideas together when you're doing your soapstone and see if you can't come up with a thesis and analysis point that interrogates or explores one of these fields kind of further. Now, if you have any questions, of course, in this process, you know you can always come to me. Email is best, guys. Email is the best possible solution. It's the thing I check the most. It's the thing I'm on the most. I'm on D2L more than I'm on my phone for sure. So please do email me if you have questions, and good luck with your primary source analysis. And I'll see you back here for chapter 4.